We're continuing our series that we are doing this month on the Gospel of John. We're looking at, in terms of our lessons, we're calling it, He Came for Days Like These. It's a good reminder that Jesus came, and what He came to do through His life on earth was not just to redeem us of our sins, but through His life recorded in the Gospels, we find real help for real struggles that we face every single day. And so we find great teachings, great practical advice, great practical lessons about how to navigate through the storms we face in life through looking at the life of Christ. And so today we're looking at John 10, and we're talking about how Jesus came for days in need of direction, some guidance. I heard a story a couple years ago about a photographer for one of the national magazines, and he was called by his director, his manager. He said, there's been a forest fire near where we are. You need to go to the airport, and you need to get as many photographs of this as possible, as soon as possible, to beat the other magazines. Go to the airport. There'll be a plane waiting for you on the runway. And so he got to the airport, and sure enough, there was one of those small little passenger pilot planes on the airport. The engine was running. And so he ran up and he jumped in. He says, okay, let's go. And so the pilot took around. He turned around, and off in the air they went. And he said to the pilot, I need you to take 3 and 4 low passes around the flame so I can get a good view of the smoke. And the pilot said, why? He said, well, I'm a photographer. Yeah, I got to take pictures. That's why I'm here. I'm here to take pictures. There's a long pause before he says, oh, you're not the instructor? Whoops, wrong plane. I love that. I love that little story because I think a lot of us can relate with the pilot. There are days in which we just need a little help. We need some guidance. We need someone to show us what it is we're doing, whether that's just our daily walk, being a light into this world, as Jeremy prayed, or if it's more specific things, as to which we'll get to tonight. There are times in which we need some specific guidance for our journey here on earth, and Jesus came for that reason. John 10 is a fascinating section here. John 10 picks up from the dialogue that takes place in John chapter 9, because look down with me in verse 19. It says in John 10 verse 19, a division occurred again among the Jews because of these words. Many of them were saying, he has a demon and is insane. Why do you listen to him? Others were saying, these are not the sayings of one demon-possessed. A demon cannot open the eyes of the blind, can he? This whole section is a continuation of the events of chapter 9. In chapter 9, Jesus and his apostles come across this man who has been blind from birth. And so the apostles are wanting to question the reason he is blind, and Jesus wants to heal the man, and he gives him his sight back. But that causes great controversy. He goes back and shares the great news that he has his sight restored, and instead of rejoicing, the Pharisees question his story. They question the fact whether he was blind or not. And then when all the truth comes about, they kick him out of the synagogue for not agreeing with their stance on who Jesus was. And so Jesus unveils in the end of John chapter 9 the idea that the ones who were really blind were the Pharisees, the ones who had no sight. And so he says in chapter 9 verse 40, those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, we are not blind too, are we? And Jesus said to him, if you were blind, you would have no sin, but since you say, we see, your sin remains. He says, it's obvious. You don't understand. You're not seeing things clearly. You're more blind than the man I just restored the sight to. So all that took place, and then he continues this teaching in chapter 10 using the analogy, the imagery of shepherds and shepherding. And so he's talking to the same group of people. I want you to pick up with me John chapter 10, beginning of verse 1. Notice what he says. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he's a thief and a robber. But he who enters the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. A stranger they simply will not follow, but will flee from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus spoke to them, but they did not understand what those things were to which he had been saying to them. So Jesus said to them again, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming, and he leaves the sheep, and he flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he's a hired hand, and he's not concerned about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it again. And so he talks about this idea of shepherding, shepherds and sheep. And he begins by talking about how the sheep, understand, we know that's God's people. He's talking about people. Psalm 100 says, we are the sheep of God's pasture. He's talking about everyday people. He says the sheep were plagued because of enemies. And in this section, he describes 3 different kinds of enemies. There's a thief, verse 1, verse 8, and verse 10. He comes in a different way. If someone tries to enter your house through a window, it's obvious they do not belong there. Anyone who tries to enter into a place through an access that's not the main door, not the main way, it's obvious they do not belong there. That's the thief. He is coming to take what does not belong to him, coming to take and steal the sheep. And then he talks about the wolf in verse 12, this wolf which snatches and scatters, it's a wolf that devours, that which he can get his paws upon. And then he describes the hireling in verse 12. And you might think, wait, hold on. The hireling is like a manager, someone you would hire to watch your sheep. Some of you might have done this. When you go out of town, you pay someone to watch your animals. That's a hireling. They are paid by the owner to watch over the animals. Well, how is that an enemy? Well, when he does his job, he's a friend. When he does what he's supposed to do, he's an ally. But this hireling, when he sees the wolf coming, when he sees the enemy approaching, he runs. Instead of stepping out in front of danger, he goes the opposite way because he says, they're not mine. They're not my sheep. I'm not going to get in harm's way. They're not my sheep. And so he's considered an enemy because he is not held, or he's not doing what he is held responsible for. He's not doing what he was entrusted to, and that is caring for the sheep. All these are then placed in contrast to the shepherd, the good shepherd, the real shepherd. But at least at face value, do you see what Jesus is doing here? He lists 3 enemies, the thief, the wolf, and the hireling. And we could look at this and apply these enemies to different applications. We might say that is Satan through his forces, or that is false teachers at large today. And there's different applications we could apply to these enemies. But at least in the context, see what Jesus is saying. These enemies are the Jewish leaders. These are the Pharisees. Those who are placed in responsibility for leading God's people, and they had not. God's people, the Pharisees, they were thieves, stealing God's people, placing on them burdens they could not keep. If you're going to be faithful to God, you have to keep our traditions. Stealing their allegiance from the one true God, even from Christ when he came. They are the hirelings. The hirelings who were entrusted to keep the sheep safe. And yet, where are the Pharisees in regards to spiritual Israel? Where are they in keeping them close to God, faithful to the law, obedient to their master? And they're the wolf which snatches, destroys, and devours. Remember what Jesus said to the Pharisees in Matthew 23 and verse 14? Woe to you, Pharisees, who devour widows' houses. That's them. This is the religious leaders. If I keep a marker here in John 10 and look back with me, go to the book of Ezekiel 34. I want to show you 2 times in Scripture when God's condemnation of his leaders, it almost mirrors exactly what Jesus is talking about here in John 10. It's 2 times in particular. Here in Ezekiel 34 is one such example. Ezekiel 34, beginning in verse 1. The prophet says, "Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to those shepherds, Thus says the Lord God, Woe, shepherds, and say to those shepherds, Thus says the Lord God, Woe, shepherds of Israel who've been feeding themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flock? You eat the fat and you clothe yourselves with wool. You slaughter the fat sheep without feeding the flock. Those who are sickly you've not strengthened. The disease you've not healed. The broken you've not bound up. The scattered you've not brought back. Nor have you sought for the lost. But with force and severity you have dominated them. They were scattered for a lack of a shepherd, and they became food for every beast of the field, and they were scattered. My flock wandered through all the mountains and on every high hill. My flock was scattered over all the surface of the earth, and there was no one to search or seek for them. Here's similar language to what Jesus talked about with the thief and the wolf and the hireling. You didn't take care of them. You scattered them. You didn't heal them. You wounded them, actually. You ate the fat sheep. Now, go over to the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 23. I want you to notice another example. Jeremiah chapter 23. Listen again. And so when God here through Ezekiel or God through Jeremiah is talking to shepherds, shepherds was a term used to describe the leaders of Israel, whether that were the priests or the prophets or the kings. It was a term used and understood for the leaders of Israel. So listen again to the leaders of Israel. God says in Jeremiah 23, beginning in verse 1, he says, "Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Therefore, thus says the Lord God of Israel concerning the shepherds who are tending my people. You scattered my flock and driven them away. You've not attended to them. Behold, I'm about to attend to you for the evil of your deeds, declares the Lord. Then I myself will gather the remnant of my flock from all the countries where I have driven them and bring them back to their pasture, and they will be fruitful and multiply. I will also raise up shepherds over them, and they will tend to them. And they will not be afraid any longer, nor will they be terrified, nor will any be missing, declares the Lord." So hear it again. You didn't do your job. In fact, you notice when he said, he calls them shepherd, but he says, you didn't take care of my sheep. In other words, while I call you shepherds, let's be honest, you are hirelings. I am the one who owns the sheep, and you've not been taking care of them as I entrusted you to. In fact, what's interesting is when you go back to the Gospel of John, don't we see this played out in chapter 9? This attitude of leadership, the enemies described in chapter 10, don't we see that same kind of attitude in chapter 9? The man who was born blind comes to the Pharisees. Do they believe him at first? No. They question his story. And then when he continues to tell his story, they question the fact whether he was blind at all. And then when he persists in telling them the truth, they kick him out of the synagogue, a place of learning and worship and instruction. They get him away from God. They're a lot like the enemies more than they are the shepherd. And that's the point of John 10. Jesus is coming and he's contrasting the leaders of Israel with himself, the true shepherd. And so he gives two images here in John 10 to show this contrast. Number one, he calls himself the door in verse 7 and in verse 9. What's interesting is during this time, sheepfolds were of two kinds. You had outdoor sheepfolds, places to store your sheep, if you're not familiar with sheep terms. It was made of rocks. It was a circle made of rocks, and there was no door. Like a U, but there's no door in front of it. And so the shepherd would come and he'd put his sheep inside this fold, and then he, if you wanted them to be there, he would lay down for the door. And any sheep that would try and leave, it would have to go through him. He literally was the door. Now there was also a different sheepfold that was more sophisticated. It was in town. It was an actual building. And so if the shepherd wanted to go to town, he would bring all of his sheep to this place. It had an actual door and a manager to watch over those sheep. He'd bring his sheep inside. They'd go in there. He'd go to town and do what he needed to do. But then when he was done, he'd come back to the door. Well, how would he get his sheep? Because you might have multiple shepherds there at the same time, and so multiple groups of sheep all in this one room. Isn't that how John began? I call, and they know my voice. The shepherd would call out, whatever it would be. Maybe it's just his voice. Maybe it's a special song. And those sheep would come out of the midst, and they'd all come to him. Jesus uses both imagery, which they would have been familiar with, to talk about himself, his role. He says, I am the door, that outdoor sheepfold. We think of it. I am the access to life. I am the access to good pasture, green pasture. I am the access to God. John 14:6, I am the way and the truth and the life. Or you might think of it, I am your protection. I'm the door. You have to get through me to get to the sheep. You have to go through me to get to my people. And so he calls himself the door, but then he also calls himself the good shepherd, and he shows us why. Because he knows the sheep. In verse 14, he knows each and every sheep. It's not that he knows the sheepfold. He knows each and every individual sheep because he knows them by name, and he calls them by name, and they listen. And it's not just that he knows the sheep, he protects the sheep. While the hireling flees, by implication, the shepherd stays. When danger arises, the hireling runs, the shepherd steps out in between the sheep and the danger to protect them, even to the point he says 2 times here that he gives his life for the sheep, lays down his life for the sheep. So willing to preserve their best interest, their life, he gives his own life, and it's not just so that they could live. You look at verse 10, what he's pointing to, he gives his life so that they could have abundant life, real life. And if we understand this, if we understand what Jesus is saying here by this analogy, that we are sheep and he is a shepherd and not just a shepherd, that he is a good shepherd, it kind of behooves us then, brethren, doesn't it? If he is the shepherd as we understand him to be and we the sheep, it sort of behooves us then to know the shepherd personally, doesn't it? As he knows us, to know this Lord, not just know facts about him, but to know his will, to know his heart, and to know his mind. As Paul was saying in Philippians 3, the surpassing value that exists of being intimate in a relationship with Jesus Christ. And it behooves us then to listen to the shepherd, to know his voice among many voices. Well, is this not a plea for our times today? And all the things that we hear and all the messages that are taught, to know his voice, to know what his word is, and then, of course, to follow him carefully because he's leading us to life and he's leading us to the green pastures. And so to ensure I don't go my own way, and I don't drift off by another shepherd or by another hireling, that I stay with the Lord where he's taking me. That's the call from John 10. Look at your shepherd and stay with him. So what Jesus does here, Jesus is providing real direction, at least in our context, for the leaders of Israel. John 9, they failed. And John 10, Jesus gives them direction. If you want to be a leader of God's people, you want to be a real shepherd to how God has called you to be, let me provide you with some direction. This is what it looks like to be a shepherd. This is what it looks like to care for sheep. Now, I want to change focus for the rest of our time tonight. Because I thought of something here, something interesting. I find it fascinating. Maybe it's just me, but I think it's interesting that when God talks about leadership in the Bible, he uses the word and the imagery of a shepherd. I mean, who would think of that? You think of like an army general, right? Or for us, president. He looks presidential. I use that word today. One church had this gospel meeting flyer and said, boy, that guy looks presidential. I don't know if that's a good thing or bad, but he looked the part, head and shoulders. When God used the word for leadership, he pointed to shepherding. Right? And so when he chose David, Psalm 78, verse 71, he chose David from the care of ewes with suckling lambs and brought him to shepherd Jacob his people and Israel his inheritance. He chose a shepherd for the job of shepherding, and that job was to be king. Leadership is synonymous with shepherding. And so we looked at the book of Ezekiel 34. God called his leaders shepherds. And so today, though we call them elders, or we might call them bishops, or we might call them overseers, their job is described in 1 Peter 5, verse 2 as shepherding the flock of God. And so leadership, in many ways, God sees leadership synonymous with shepherding. If you understand how to care for sheep, you understand what it means to be a leader. And I believe, good brethren, all of us are called to lead in some facet or another in our lives. I want to look at one specific avenue tonight, one specific application of leadership that I think we can learn some principles from John 10. So I want you to consider with me, how can we shepherd our families? What do we learn from the Good Shepherd about how to shepherd our homes, our families? I have 8 things, and it's 8 o'clock. They're not going to be long. They're not going to be long. In fact, it's going to be long enough for you to get the idea and go home and talk about this with your family. Long enough for you to do some digging and thinking about this. But I think as we navigate through John 10, and we look at what Jesus is showing us about himself, showing us about what it means to be a real leader, I think we learn some things that can help us in our homes. So here's some principles, quick and easy principles. 8 things. How do we shepherd our homes? Here's number 1. We got to lead them through the door. Verse 9, that's the goal of this shepherd, is that he is leading his sheep through the door. And if we understand what he means by door, when you look at verse 9, if anyone enters through me, he will be saved. I think the goal of all parents godly parents, is to have our children have a real, genuine relationship with Jesus Christ. We might use the word conversion. What we're talking about is their salvation. They obey the gospel and they submit to Christ. But here's the thing, good brethren. We cannot lead them through the door if we've not gone through the door ourselves. We just cannot. The one thing that will ruin the faith in our children more than anything else is the hypocrisy they see in their parents' faith. Now, there's a difference. There's a difference between parents who are imperfect and parents who are fake. There's a difference. And the thing is, our children will know the difference. They'll understand when mom and dad make mistakes and they apologize and they seek forgiveness versus mom and dad who are one way Sunday morning, but when we go home, everything is different. Everything changes. You know, I like the phrase that Paul used about Timothy. He says, I'm mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt, or some versions will say first existed in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I'm sure it's in you as well. It's a principle. You cannot teach what you do not know. You cannot share what you do not have. And so if I genuinely desire to lead my children to Christ, good brethren, I have to be all in committed to Christ. I have to be converted. I have to be a disciple. I have to ensure I have gone through the door. Nothing short of the genuine relationship will exist, will succeed. And so if my desire is for my children to have a real relationship with Jesus, I have to ensure that I have that real relationship and that my prayers and my attitude and my teaching are reflective of that truth. And if I have a real relationship with Jesus, if I've walked through the door, it's going to be evident in my life. You're not going to have to question. I have to look for it. Jeremy prayed that greatness prayer. If we exist with Jesus, it's going to be demonstrated in everyday living. You're going to see it. The fruit of the Spirit is going to be pouring out from us. But if it's not, I realize in my life I leave from here and I'm a different person, I might need to question, have I stepped out of that door? Have I even gone in the first place? Am I really converted? Am I really committed to Jesus? That's the goal of shepherds, to lead your sheep to life, through the door. Here's another one. The goal of a shepherd of your family, it's a responsibility to know them on an individual basis. And that's the shepherd here. He knows his sheep. He's calling them by name, and they know his voice in verse 4. Down in verse 14, he says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Anyone who is a parent of more than one child knows that children are different. Isn't that amazing? Every child is different. You can have children who share the same biology, same mom and dads. You can have children born the same day, twins and triplets, and yet they're completely different, inside and out. You know what that means? It's one thing to know your sheep as a whole. It's one thing to know your sheep individually, each sheep. It's one thing to understand your family dynamic as a whole. It's another thing to understand every child the way that they are and the way they were created. I like the language the psalmist uses, Psalm 127, verse 4. He says, like arrows in the hands of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. I love the imagery of arrows. There's an author who wrote it this way. He says, as I write these words, I'm looking at 3 arrows on my desk. They differ from one another. Any archer could see that at a glance. And yet, in other ways, they're remarkably similar. They're good arrows. But then again, they're not much better than the archer who notches them on the bow. They're not much better than the smoothness of the release. No matter how finely crafted these arrows might be, accuracy demands a trained full draw and a disciplined release. As I write these words, I'm looking at a picture on my desk. It's a picture of my 3 sons. Those are arrows. Every arrow is different. The training may be similar, and yet the understanding of that arrow, the responsibility of that arrow to where it belongs is going to be different. I need to understand and know each child. You know, it's sort of language, if you want to keep the shepherding language. The proverb writer says, know well the condition of your flock and pay attention to your herd. I love this. You need to camp out here for a minute. He says, know well the condition of your flock. Pay attention to your herds. Do you know your sheep? Do you know your kids? Like, do you know what makes them tick? Do you know their strengths and their weaknesses? Do you know what makes them unique? Do you know their struggles, the things they're not good at? Do you know maybe areas where they could improve, that they need some guidance? Are you annoyed with me right now? What's that last phrase he said up there? Isn't that a painful admonition today for modern parents? Pay attention. Pay attention to your flock. Can't tell you how many times we've seen it. I'm sure you have too. You go to a ball game and there's Johnny going for the score, but mom and dad are on the phone. There they are at dinner. Time that used to be a great moment of fellowship and learning about one's day, but everyone's on the phone. And we're home and our kids are learning and they're growing. They're hungry for attention. But mom's too busy writing some quotes about how to be a good parent on Facebook rather than being a good parent at home. Nothing will substitute your time and attention for your kids, especially when they're young. Nothing will. The shepherd knows each sheep and he knows them individually. Your children are not the same. They will not be the same, which means they may need different raising, different techniques, different ways of discipline and correction. None of that will be effective without the foundation of a firm relationship with that child. A strong relationship with that child. You know, if we would apply the wisdom of James 1, verse 27. James 1:27, James 1:19. James 1:27 is good too, with orphans and widows. James 1:19, let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. How do you get to know your children individually? How do you get to know them one-on-one? Time. That's all it takes is time. And I know you're saying that's all it takes. That is what it takes, is time. Time devoted with your children. Time with each individual child. But that demands listening. Imagine how many issues would be solved if we applied that wisdom in James. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. And so instead of blowing at the top, I told you to do this, why aren't you doing this, why are you acting this way? If we stopped and said, tell me what's going on. Share with me what's going on in your life. Why are you having a hard time? It seems like you're bothered. Share with me. We might find out there's more behind this attitude. There's more behind this behavior. There's more behind the scenes. And I know then where to speak. And anger may be avoided altogether. Knowing each individual sheep. This requires something we'll talk about here in a moment. It requires something you're going to have to be willing to give. Attention is spelled in 4 letters, and that's time. Time. 10 years ago, I was training to be a preacher, and I had the blessing and opportunity to sit down in an afternoon with Paul Earnhardt. And he said, what do you want to know? And I said, everything. Everything. Whatever you have to say. And he said a lot I don't remember. I have it recorded, but I don't remember a lot because it all went up here. But I'll tell you one thing I never forgot. He says, when you have kids, and you will, be home. Nothing will take your place. And I've needed that. Home. Knowing each individual kid, what they need from me as a father, what they need from you as a mother. Every child is different. Every sheep is different. Shepherds have to know their sheep on an individual basis. That's just going to take you having time learning them and growing with them. You guys set the example, verse 4. It's interesting, isn't it? He doesn't go behind them driving the whip. He's not a cowboy. He's a shepherd. He leads the way. He's out in front. Good brethren, we cannot lead our family where we ourselves are not walking. And so we expect our family to go a certain way, to behave a certain way, to do certain things. We need to be doing them in our lives. Because here's the thing, if we want our children to speak kindly to one another, we better be speaking kind words. If we want our children to be quick to forgive, we better be quick to forgive and not hold grudges, especially with our children. Especially with our children. If we want our children to be cheerful servants around the house, don't bone them and moan and drag your feet every time we ask you to do the dishes. I want you to be a cheerful servant. Well, are you moaning every time you got to do the dishes? Are you dragging your feet to cut the yard? What is the example I'm setting? Because here's the thing. Through my example, I am teaching my children what's most important in my life. Through my example, I am teaching my children how to love their future mate. They're learning that through me. Through my example, I'm teaching my children how to handle discouragement and hard times, Is all lost? Do I stop praying when life gets hard? They're going to learn that through me. They learn through me how to be honest with your faults. When you fail, and you will fail, and they will know when you fail, they'll learn what you do. You cover it up, you play it off, you just ignore it, or do you confess and you repent and you seek forgiveness? Good brethren, they're going to learn how to worship through us. They watch you when you worship. And they watch me when we worship. The greatest teaching they're going to learn is not through what we say, but through what we do. And understand this is easy to understand, and this is horrible to apply. It's hard to apply. It's hard. You know what I hate doing? I hate listening to myself after I've preached. That's awful. That's worse than waterboarding. But there's something worse than that. When we started doing the video recordings, Holly had me watch a video once. I hate that. I don't know why y'all still keep me here. You ever wondered that? If someone took a video of your day-to-day living, just one day, could you stand to watch yourself? And yet, is that not the day-to-day life of your family? They're just watching you. And they're learning. And they're growing. And so lead out front. Don't lead from behind. If you want it done, if you want it to be grown inside their hearts, you got to lead by your example. Here's another one. Lead them to the pasture of God's words. Now, I understand in verse 9, he's talking about life and life eternal, but at the end of that verse, he talks about how those who go in and those who come out through Christ, they're going to find pasture. And pasture in terms of sheep, it's a safe place. It's a peaceful place. It's a place where they go to get well fed. Pasture's grass, and they eat. I will tell you, if there's anything we have learned through our hardship with this fire, there's one thing I hope our parents have learned and appreciated, especially those of you who have remained with us. You've been here since the first day, smoke and all. You've been here. This is not the place, the primary place that your kids are going to learn about God. It cannot be. This is a snack. This is a supplement to the daily meal they've got to get at home. It is not the responsibility of the church to teach our kids about God and the Word. It's not. It's not the responsibility of schools. And you might have a great Bible-based school with good teachers, but it's not the school's responsibility. And when we act like it is, we become hirelings. We become hirelings to our kids and say someone else is going to step in and take responsibility. It's ours. It's our job. It's our job to teach our kids about God. It's our job to teach our children about the Bible, the truth. Now, here's the thing. You can never start too early and make it fun. Oh, make it fun. The Bible's not boring. It wasn't written to be boring. And if you're bored, you're not reading it right. Bring it to life. Sing songs. You may not be able to carry a tune in a bucket like me, but sing, and they'll learn. They'll learn about the apostles. They'll learn about Jesus. They'll learn the books of the Bible. You can never start too early with your kids, but you can wait until it's too late. You can. The responsibility of parents to lead their children into the Word of God is something that the law talked about in Deuteronomy 6. I love this. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You notice it says you're only supposed to talk about God when you're in church, and then you just go home and talk about other things. I mean, you look at this, and he says you're walking down the path, and you're going in the forest, and he says, look at that tree, let's talk about God. And then you're lying down by the way, you're getting ready to go to bed, but you know what you're thinking about and you're talking about? God. In other words, it's part of your everyday life and your everyday conversation. It's natural. When they have a question, I bring it back to God. When they're curious about something, I take it back to God. When I want to share something cool with them, somehow I'm going to wrap it up and take it back to God. Even yesterday, I was asking Benjamin, who created ice cream. He hesitated, saying God. I said, let's talk about that. Where's milk come from? Where's cows come from? Oh, it all comes from God. And you think God is amazing. He is. Because it all goes back to Him. That's the point, though. That's our responsibility as shepherds, to lead these sheep to the green pastures, to lead them to where they're going to be fed. That's on us. It's the responsibility of shepherds to guard them from danger. You step out into the way and you guard them from danger, and that can be a lot of things today. It can be dangerous influences. It could be friends. It could be the influence of the world. I imagine most of us, if a person came to the door and said, sir, I would like to teach your kids about sexuality. I would like to teach them about same-sex marriage. I would like to share with them every dirty word in the book. There'd be some karate chops in a closed door. And yet to give our children unfiltered, unmonitored access to a smartphone and the internet, we've given them far worse. Far worse. Our jobs, parents, We're the door of our home. We're the guards at the gate. We're the shepherd looking out for sheep, looking for danger. That's on us, especially men. It's not your wife's primary responsibility, it's yours. It's our job, men. We lead at home. We protect our wives, we protect our kids. That's what God laid before us. It's our responsibility. It's the role of a shepherd. You keep your sheep safe, especially safe against the evil one who wants your family badly. It's the responsibility of a shepherd to be willing to sacrifice. I find that phrase again in verse 11 interesting. He says, I'm the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. This is what I wanted to pick up from what I put down a minute ago. Pick up that peg. Obviously, nothing we do in this life will ever compare to what Jesus did, what Jesus gave on the cross. But I believe I'm talking with a family here who understands that if you're really going to be a parent with the full responsibility that God has laid upon you, there's going to be some sacrifices you have to be willing to give. One of those is time. If you really want to be a good parent, you have to give your time, especially when they're young, especially when they're forming those thoughts and forming those ideas. You have to give your time. And there's going to be occasions in your life when you may have to pass by opportunities, sacrifice opportunities. You're going to have to sacrifice maybe some friendships. You're going to have to sacrifice some of your energy. You're going to have to sacrifice some of yourself. Why? Why did the Good Shepherd sacrifice himself? Why did he lay down his life? Well, for the best interest of the sheep. He had in his mind abundant life. And so he was willing to lay down his life if it meant leading them to abundant life. And we sacrifice, and we give, and we pour it out, and we might not ever hear a thank you. We might not ever give a card saying, I realize all the things you did for me, and I'm so sorry I made it hard, but thank you. We might not give any of that, and yet it's worth it. Why? Because we want them to get to life, real life in Jesus. And so we'll make some sacrifices, and life is going to be hard. And for a season in our life, well, in our season in our life, we might be missing. Might be missing sleep. Might be missing close time with our mates, having intimate conversations with one another, without interrupting fingers under the doors. We might miss some opportunities. Count the cost, good brethren. What's it all for? Is it worth it? And you always love them. You always love your kids. It doesn't say that here in this context. In fact, I want you to turn to a passage that does. It says here what's implied in John chapter 10. I want you to turn over to Luke 15. We know the shepherd loves his sheep, or else he wouldn't have stepped in front of them. He wouldn't have stepped in front of them when danger's on the other side. We know the shepherd loves his sheep because he wouldn't be willing to lay down his own life if he didn't. But Luke 15 puts that in words. It puts it in words we understand full and well, because in Luke 15 he tells three stories. Jesus tells three stories about three lost things. The first is sheep. Guy has 100 sheep, he loses one, the shepherd goes. There's a woman who has 10 coins, she loses one. She spends the entire day looking through that house, top to bottom, to find the coin. And then there's a father. There's a father who has two lost sons, one who runs and one at home. Both sons are loved tenderly by the father. Both sons receive grace and mercy from the Father. I'm going to tell you, good brethren, there's not anything your children need more in their life than to know that they are loved by their parents in good times and in bad, in good behavior and in bad behavior. To know my parents will always love me. Because you see that parable of the Good Samaritan, or of the prodigal son. That first son, he goes and he runs. He thinks he's a hot shot. He's got everything he wants. He has money, he has fame, he has parties, he's living it up. So when all of it ends, the money ends, the friends go away, the food's gone, and he's absolutely abandoned. When you look down at verse 17, what is it that drove him home? What is it that changed his heart and said, you know what? I need to go back. I need to go back to the Father. Because look at verse 17. Does it say, when he realized my father is going to rip my hide, he is going to punish me so bad, I've got to get home, or he's going to make life rough. Was that what it says? He just keep on running. He did a pig. What brought him home? What was it that he said, you know what? I know how low things are here. I've got to get home. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of the Father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I'm dying here with hunger? It was the love of the Father. How good things were at home. This father is so good even to servants. If I just go home and be a servant in his household, that'd be far better than being slave in the far country. Nothing will communicate this more to your kids than constant, reaffirming love. I love you. Like there's a preacher who was telling his story. He has a son. Let me just throw things down for a minute. Kick these around for a minute. He had this son who made life hard for him. Not that any of you understand what that's like. Having a teenager who grew out his beard, who had piercings all up and down his ears, who ran away from home and was living in quasi-men's dormitory, who knows where. He made life hard for his dad, who was a preacher in the Chicago area. His preacher's last name was Bailey. Well, one night Bailey gets a call, and it's from the police, and they say, "Sir, we've got your son." And so he goes to the police station, and he's not there. And he goes to the next police station in the next town, and he's not there. And in fact, no one even knows what he's talking about. It was a prank. He realized what had happened. He realized that his son had just pranked him to make life hard. On the way home, he stopped by the dormitory, that place where his son was at. All of them, at this point, it was very late, all of them were asleep. And so he walked in and he stepped over all the boys that were sleeping all over the place, and he opened the room, and sure enough, there was his son asleep. And so he went over to his son, and he kissed him on the cheek, and he went home. This is what he wrote. He says, "My son is a preacher now. He told me not long ago," he says, "Dad, do you know what turned me around?" Bailey said, "No, son, what?" He said, "It was that night when you came into my room and kissed me in the middle of the night. You didn't know that I was awake, but I was. I thought, if my dad loves me that much, I'd better get my life together with the Lord." That's love. Nothing will mean more to our kids. Nothing will serve as a stronger or more solid foundation on what we're trying to build them into than love. We always love you. Good days and bad. Those are things we need to say to our kids. Good parents, you're doing great things. It's easy to beat up on ourselves and to say you need to be doing more and you need to work harder, and there's times and a place for that. But you're doing good work. You're doing a great work with your kids. You're doing the most important work with your families, trying to lead them to the Lord. Remember this from tonight. You're not a hireling. You're not a hireling simply sent to watch over them, to spend some time with your sheep. They're yours. They're your kids. They're your children. Who they are and what they become is largely due to your influence and how you lead them. And so in the days that you feel directionless, aimless, not sure what to do, confused and lost because of what's going on at home, look to your good shepherd, good brethren. Look to Jesus. He shows you how to lead. He shows you how to care for those entrusted under your responsibility. Pray to God and lean on the Lord, and He's going to see you through. We're going to have a prayer and then a closing song, and then we'll be dismissed to go on our ways.